Our identity as a nation, unlike many other nations, is not determined by geography or ethnicity, by soil or blood. Being an American involves the embrace of high ideals and civic responsibility. We become the heirs of Thomas Jefferson by accepting the ideal of human dignity found in the Declaration of Independence. We become the heirs of James Madison by understanding the genius and values of the U.S. Constitution. We become the heirs of Martin Luther King Jr. by recognizing one another not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This means that people of every race, religion, ethnicity can be fully and equally American.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and CEO of the George W. Bush Presidential Center, Shiloh Brooks.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us at the Bush Center's Forum on Leadership. And let me also welcome everybody watching online at bushcenter.org. Let me first thank President and Mrs. Bush for their leadership and their support of me and this whole institution. I can't say how grateful we are. I'd also like to thank our board of directors, the Executive Advisory Council, the Corporate Leadership Society, and each and every supporter of the Bush Center over the years. On behalf of all of us, know that we're grateful for your support and we're dedicated to ensuring that this is a vibrant and impactful place for years to come. The theme for this year's Forum on Leadership is the heart of America. At the Bush Center, we proudly use the words heart and leadership in the same breath. President and Mrs. Bush led our country with heart. Our work embraces their legacy to promote values-based public policy and civic education informed by the heart of America. I say this fully knowing that there are some who whispered that the heart of America doesn't beat with the same vigor that it once did, that we need a heart transplant, or that we're on life support because we've had a heart attack, as evidenced by the fact that Americans disagree about so much. This morning, I want to challenge the premise that the disagreements we have necessarily imply dysfunction of heart. To the contrary, when disagreement is done well, it's vital for our nation's survival. The American people do and will continue to disagree fervently. This is an essential feature of our Republican form of government, not a drawback of it. Recall the great disagreements at the Constitutional Convention chronicled by James Madison, the great public debates about slavery in which the young Abraham Lincoln rose to prominence, and the disagreements about whether and when America should enter the two world wars. Disagreement may be America's current problem, but it has long been her solution and her savior. Pursuit of the common good requires that reasonable and charitable people be allowed to engage in civic disagreement in pursuit of what is just and right. May the best arguments win on their merits alone. Engaging in civic discourse does not require us to banish passionate disagreement from the public square. It requires recovering the reason, charity, modesty, and goodwill that make disagreement productive and fruitful among citizens of mutual affection. We must reclaim that rarest of things that I am here calling the American heart, so that we can disagree without harboring the disgust with one another that destroys unity. This is not mere rhetoric, and I am not the first to make this point. I invite you to turn back the clock with me to a pivotal moment in American history. The year is 1801. Thomas Jefferson has just defeated his arch-rival John Adams in a hotly contested presidential election filled with polarizing partisanship and bawdy political insults. Did you know that Adams supporters called Jefferson a, quote, hideous hermaphroditical character? Did you know that Jefferson supporters called Adams, quote, a mean-spirited lowlife? At the time of the election, prices were surging across the country due to a major war in Europe, and a second undeclared war called the Quasi-War had recently broken out with France. Name-calling, trade tensions, quasi-wars. Sound familiar? President-elect Jefferson's defeat of incumbent President Adams marked the first peaceful transition of power between parties in the history of our nation, and those parties were bitter rivals. In Jefferson's first inaugural, delivered March 4th, 1801, he urged his fellow citizens to set aside their disagreements and, quote, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are dreary things. And let us reflect that having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, and as capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. Jefferson's exhortation to Americans to unite with one heart is 225 years old, but it could have been written yesterday. We would do well to heed the wisdom of the man whose nickname was the Sage of Monticello. This year's Forum on Leadership unofficially kicks off the Bush Center America at 250 celebration. Our first panel this morning features David French and Ann Wicks discussing the sacred right of free speech, without which the loud beat of the American heart would be silenced. There have been attempts in the past to silence that beating heart. The brave men and women who kept it beating utilized their right to speak freely so that their fellow citizens could think freely. Free speech is a means to thought. It is not an end in itself. It enables the free exchange of ideas, required to educate voting citizens to think for themselves about what is best for this nation. Indulge my professorial tendencies and turn back the clock with me one more time. The year is now 1860, 59 years after Jefferson's inauguration. President Lincoln has just been elected. An escaped slave named Frederick Douglass stands in front of a large crowd at the Tremont Temple Baptist Church in Boston to deliver a lecture for the second time in a week. He faces the crowd for a second time because his first attempt to lecture on the evils of slavery was shut down by a mob. On that day in Boston, reflecting on the violence that silenced his speech 6 days prior, Douglass told the assembled crowd, quote, "No right was deemed by the fathers of the government more sacred than the right of free speech. It was in their eyes, as in the eyes of all thoughtful men, the great moral renovator of society and government. Liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That right, of all rights, is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power. Thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers founded in injustice and wrong are sure to tremble if men are allowed to reason of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come in their presence. Slavery," he said, "cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its existence would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South." Our first conversation today invites us to reflect on the right Frederick Douglass called the dread of tyrants. Ann Wicks, the Bush Institute's Don Evans Family Managing Director of Opportunity and Democracy, will moderate. There is no one better to discuss free speech than a journalist, especially since Frederick Douglass ran a newspaper. David French is a journalist of patient thoughtfulness and many talents. He writes for the New York Times, but he's also a lawyer, he's a nonfiction author, and a soldier. His bio in the New York Times states that in 2006, he obtained an age waiver from the Army and joined the JAG Corps as an Army lawyer. After dragging his old body through basic training, those are his words, not mine, he volunteered to deploy to Iraq, where he served with a 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment during the height of the surge in 2007. For his service, he was awarded a Bronze Star. Please join me in welcoming Ann Wicks and David French.
Good morning, everyone. I like a good crowd response. It's great to see you all. Thank you for being with us for this conversation. I hope you think of this a little bit as a social studies seminar for grown-ups. This is going to be really fun, and I think David will help explain some things and give us a little call to action. So let's dive right in. So we'll go back to that Boston moment in 1860 when Frederick Douglass is attempting to give a speech. As Shiloh mentioned, he's shouted down. He comes back 6 days later. And he gives that talk, but he adds sort of this profound addendum around free speech. Can you tell us, they had 3 big ideas in that. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So, I'm so glad that Shiloh read the whole quote. It's almost like this is a coordinated event. It's amazing. I'm so glad he read the whole thing because almost all of the 3 concepts are just encapsulated in that short quote.
Yeah.
And so number 1 was this marvelous phrase, the great moral renovator of society and government. In other words, what is it that allows us to get better? I mean, if you're going to go back and you're going to look at the founding generation who articulated these incredible declarations and statements of human rights, they also knew that they didn't live up to these ideals. They were keenly aware of it. There were many people within the founding generation keenly aware that the country at that moment didn't live up to these ideals. But what they did is they set in place an engine of renewal, an engine of transformation, and that was free speech. And there's a reason why this is the very First Amendment. There's a reason why the Anti-Federalists were holding up ratification of the Constitution so that we could get the First Amendment into the Constitution. I mean, this goes back to the English Bill of Rights and sort of the way in which the rights of Englishmen were considered to be a part of it was to criticize governing authorities. So this is absolutely fundamental. So the first thing is, it is that give and take. It is that give and take that allows us to improve. It allows us to challenge. And you look back at that time, what's really remarkable is a lot of the concepts of censorship that exist now, like emotional harm and things like that, existed in the antebellum South. And there would be restrictions on speech in the antebellum South designed to protect the delicate feelings of the slave owners, for example. And so rarely, one of the things that's interesting about practicing First Amendment law is there's just nothing new. It's just constant reruns. There's probably some people in this audience old enough to remember the era of reruns. You just had 3 networks, and all during the summer, you're watching Happy Days again. Yeah. And so,
wait, are you describing America as Nick at Night? That's what you're describing?
Yeah, basically America's Nick at Night.
Okay.
And so you just have these reruns, and one of the reruns is that free speech, especially speech challenging entrenched power, causes emotional harm. And so Frederick Douglass is dealing with a lot of the same kinds of arguments that we deal with. So first, it renovates society and government. Second, because of that, because it is inherently challenging, it is the absolute first thing that an authoritarian tries to eliminate. Yeah. Free speech is the canary in the coal mine. If you're wondering, are they authoritarian? Are they not authoritarian? Look at what they do with free speech. We just had this really remarkable election in Hungary, and there was a lot of argument about, well, was Hungary authoritarian or was Hungary not authoritarian? I looked at what they did with free speech, and the winner of the election, the challenger who unseated Orban, the very first time he was on state television was after he won. And I would urge you to actually watch that interview, because I don't typically love the idea of like people dunking on you in politics and sort of hanging on the rim and swinging there and like mocking their opponent. But when he went on state television, which had trashed him for week after week, month after month, and was essentially your day is over, I got to say, I'm not Hungarian, but that was kind of fun to watch. And then the third thing...
Posterized free speech, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then the third thing really is there is no meaningful right to speak unless there's a reciprocal right to hear. And this is something that Frederick Douglass really emphasized, is that when that mob came and shouted him down and shut him down, there were a lot of people there their rights were injured. And I was in law school at the height of the shout-down era. It was so bad at my law school that there was an article, I can't remember if it was in GQ or Esquire, called Beirut on the Charles. And this is back when Beirut was the deadliest city in the Middle East. They just kind of rotate around. And at that point, it was all of the things that you experience, people have experienced now, shout downs, mobs trying to prevent people from speaking. And so I will never forget, I formed a pro-life student club at the law school. And one of the first things that happens is after we sent a letter out to the students, I got responses back that were saying things like, "Why don't you go die, you bleeping fascist?"
Yeah.
I would never say I got death threats. Those were death aspirations. I'm not going to want to try to kill you. It's just that I hope somebody or something does. And this environment and those shout downs and those jeers, they were depriving me of the ability to receive the education that I wanted to receive. And so he hit on all of the elements in just one very short, I would urge you to read it. It's maybe 1,000 words at most.
Yes.
Very short, very eloquent, and it's probably the most profound argument for free speech that's ever been written.
Okay, so homework assignment 1, read Frederick Douglass.
It's only 1,000 words.
Yes.
It's a very short, yes.
Well, then let's move forward into 2023 and another higher ed example. So there was kind of an infamous moment at the Stanford Law School. Judge Kyle Duncan, who's a conservative, had been invited to speak to the students and was shouted down. So could you tell us a little bit about that moment, but importantly, how Stanford responded to that, which was, I think, the most interesting from a free speech perspective.
So it's fascinating. What did I say? We do reruns, right? And so you had right before on the eve of the Civil War, you have a mob come and shout down and stop Frederick Douglass. And the year 2023, you have a mob of students shout down a federal judge. And what makes this particularly egregious is these were law students, some of whom were going to be practicing in front of that judge, okay? Now, I strongly believe in the integrity of the federal judiciary, that they're not going to be biased. But here's lawyering 101. Don't violate the constitutional rights of the judge that you're about to appear in front of. I mean, judges are human too, right? You don't want to give them any reason to be looking for a reason to rule against you. But so here you have these people, they interrupt a federal judge, which in the context is outrageous and egregious. If I'm practicing law and opposing counsel says something that is grossly offensive to my clients or me, I can't interrupt and say, "Objection, judge, offensive speech." I cannot do that, right? I have to deal with the argument. I have to answer the argument. And if a judge asks me a question that I don't like, I can't say, "I'm sorry, judge, did you read my list of trigger warnings before the oral argument?" You can't do that, right? You have to learn how to absorb difficult speech.
Yes.
And I love this statement from, I believe it's Justice Brennan, in a case, again, there's nothing new under the sun, called Pico versus Island Tree School District, which involved parents who are asking for library books to be removed from a school library. And this is a late 70s, early 80s case. And what he said was, the purpose of education is to prepare students to live in the pluralistic, often contentious society. And I think about that all the time. If you're not being prepared for pluralism, in other words, to encounter people who are different from you, to learn how to live and work in that environment, you're not getting a good education. And Stanford, it was almost like they got some weird version of electric shock therapy when that happened, because it was so over the top and was obviously facilitated by an administrator who was in the room, who made it even worse, who kind of smugly looked at a federal appellate judge and said something to the effect of, "I'm not sure the juice is worth the squeeze here." Again, guys, no, this is not how you treat the federal judiciary. And so it was a shocking moment. It was caught on video. That made it go more viral. And then the school essentially does almost like a academic freedom, free speech stand down, what we would call in the military a stand down day, where everyone stops and then you deliver briefings related to whatever crisis is unfolded that requires a stand down. They began to receive training in academic freedom. They began to receive, and it's interesting, there are different moments and different times that can shock a wayward institution into reality. And I feel like that moment really shocked that institution and a number of other institutions to the point now where I've got some good news about higher education. We live in a time with a lot of bleak news. Let me give you some good news. Over the past 2 to 3 years, I have talked to more college and university presidents who are determined to protect free speech in a marketplace of ideas than I have talked to in my entire career beforehand. I've become friends with the chancellor at Vanderbilt University, and Vanderbilt needs to be known for something other than its football program.
Yes. Diego.
Diego. He almost got one here. Well, not here in Austin, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's a big state.
It's a big state, yeah. Here, Texas. Anyway, and so Vanderbilt, he basically took the position, and if you know anything about higher education, this is a bold statement. He said, I want to out-Chicago Chicago. Mm-hmm. In other words, be the bastion of free speech. Then I go up and I meet with the president at Dartmouth. Very similar motivation. And you go around the country and you meet people, and this is something that's super key. You're also seeing a change and a shift in the way that schools treat admissions. For those of you who have high-achieving kids who wanted to go to the Ivies or Ivy equivalent schools, it's almost been a cliche forever. Well, you have to found like 5 nonprofits and be like this activist and all of this. Well, there's a problem there because you're bringing in people who are like 18 years old, and if they're in the activist mindset, they're not curious. Okay, and if they're not curious, then they don't value free speech that much. They will shout down, they will silence, they will censor. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing essay questions like, how did you respond to someone with whom you had a strong disagreement? How do you approach disagreeable ideas? And so you're telling like all the tiger moms and tiger dads out there to flip the orientation. It's not, Junior, become a climate change activist. It's, Junior, have a difficult conversation and write about it. Which, between these two, I have nothing against being a climate change activist, but I would strongly prefer people who are in the school-age years to be more curious and to emphasize curiosity in their approach to the world more than, at least for this time in life, more than their very deeply felt convictions.
Yes. Okay, then let's actually move to where most young people are getting their information these days, which is online.
Heaven help us.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about kind of an obscure law, Section 230. This is passed in 1996, well before there was anything like a social media platform or YouTube or whatever. But it really governs sort of responsibility for speech online, or it helps inform that. So could you tell us, what should we know about Section 230 and how it's applied? What do you want us to think about?
Yeah, so free speech online is one of the most contentious and most misunderstood concepts around. I mean, lots of people are running around talking about free speech online like they know something about it, and they don't. Yeah. And it gets frustrating. But here's the basic history. So when the internet began, one of the first things that people invented were message rooms and chat rooms. So if you're, I'm 57 years old. I remember when AOL CompuServe, you'd get the compact disc in the mail and you'd hear that noise, that was my introduction to the internet. And you would immediately see these chat rooms and comment boards and message boards. And this is one of the first ways that people would interact. Well, there were sort of 2 approaches to those message boards. Approach number 1 was anything goes. Okay, we're not going to censor, we're not going to moderate, we're not going to control. And all of a sudden, I was talking to an executive at Meta not long ago, and they said the thing about social media is it puts human nature on blast. And so what does that mean? That meant that early internet, all of a sudden you had raw sewage all over these message boards. It's attracting predators, it's attracting Nazis, it's attracting communists, and so people start to leave the message boards. So the next company comes along and says, no, we love the engagement of the message boards, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to moderate the comments. If you say something racist, we're going to take it down. If you say something sexist, if you're propositioning people, we're going to take all that down and ban you. And then they got sued. And the argument was, well, if you are moderating comments, then you are also the speaker too. So in other words, if I wrote on like a Yelp review of a Tex-Mex restaurant here, I think you can get better fajitas in Nashville, which is like slander of the whole state of Texas, right? So if I wrote that would be in the world that a lot of people wanted in the early 90s, Yelp would be liable for my slander of Texas, because, I mean, that's not a real cause of action, but just hang with me for a minute. But Yelp would be liable for my slander that I put on a comment board. And so what would that mean? No comment boards. If I'm going to be liable for everything.
Yeah.
And so what happened is Congress steps in at this moment in the 90s and says, okay, here's the deal. If you are running a platform for speech, you're not going to be held liable for your user's speech simply because you moderate it. In other words, by moderating the speech, you're not liable for the speech. The only person who's liable is the one who makes the Facebook comment, who posts the thing on Yelp, etc. And that was the rocket fuel for free speech online. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people look at that and they say, well, that's just for Meta and TikTok and Snapchat. No. Think about the comment board to my articles in the New York Times. All of that is protected by Section 230. The New York Times is not responsible for one of my very hostile readers gets on there and says all manner of bad things about me. That's not the New York Times responsibility. That is the responsibility of the person who's speaking. And so this is what we miss. What we miss is the idea that you are responsible for what you put online. If we make internet companies, social media companies, also responsible for what we put online, get ready to lose the ability to put things online, because the liability risk would just be massive. And so what my arguments are, I don't at all diminish the harm being done through social media. And I don't confine it to young people either.
Yes.
I'm sorry, guys, we don't handle our phones very well either. Talking to my peers, the amount of times I am saying the words, no, that's AI, is ridiculous. And so we have trouble handling it. But the answer is not, in my view, to shut off the avenues of free speech. The answer, in my view, is to educate the American public as to how do we live in this freewheeling, free speech, pluralistic, contentious society.
Yes. Okay. Well, then that sort of moves us into the morality.
Yes.
And so I'm excited about this question because this is hard for me. I will admit this. It's easy to talk about the beauty of free speech until you are confronted with something that is so aberrant to you. Whether you have to kind of get your mind around this. So how do we reconcile our own sense of what is right and wrong and free speech? How do we make sense of that?
Man, that is such a great question. Because one of the most common objections that I get when I talk about pluralism, when I talk about classical liberalism, the small L liberalism of the founders, is I've started to get the critique that what I'm engaged in is moral relativism. Mm-hmm. That if you're saying that, say, for example, a Muslim family has the exact same religious liberty rights as a Christian family, then is that me saying that there's no difference between Islam and Christianity? No. Does it mean that if you're going to live in this pluralistic society that we ultimately end up being, if we're going to be together in pluralism, it's just all the gathering of the squishes? Like the people who is Muslim, but not really. Yeah. Christian, but it's not, not really. My friend Ibu Patel, who's here, is just phenomenal on this point. He's like, I don't want an interfaith alliance that's a gathering of squishes. Bring together the people who I'm all in for Islam. I'm all in for Christianity. And there's a couple of ways, I think, to address this. Well, more than a couple. Let's get started and see how far we can go. Because there's a lot of answers to this, and it's one of the most important questions of our time, which is basically, how do I live in a society with people with whom I have massive disagreements without compromising my own views? So, number one, let's just start with, I think, one of the most important moral principles, humility. Mm-hmm. I loved the prayer that opened the dinner last night. It contained my favorite Bible verse, Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly. So you cannot forsake justice to be the nicest person in the room. It is to love kindness. You can't mistreat somebody in the name of your justice. And then the last part is, and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. It's to constantly remind yourself of this little reality that should always be speaking to you from the back of your mind. I might be wrong. I have a conviction. I have a deep conviction. I have real beliefs. but at the same time, I might be wrong. That should be buzzing in the back of our minds. When John Stuart Mill was making his argument for free speech, sort of from first principles, that's one of the core elements here was, I'm not God. I don't know everything. And so free speech to me becomes, in that circumstance, just an unalloyed good. So for example, if I have a deeply held conviction and I talk to somebody and we have a conversation and you convince me I'm wrong, free speech has been a huge gift to me because I've been taken from error into truth.
Yeah.
You might be thinking, well, I'm not very wrong. So what does free speech do for me then?
Yeah.
Because none of us is sitting here holding an opinion that we know to be wrong. That would be weird.
Right.
So we're all sitting here believing
Yes.
we're right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so in that circumstance, if I'm right, what does free speech do for me? Isn't it just a threat? Because couldn't interacting with you publicly on something where I'm right and you're wrong, what if some of these folks get persuaded?
Yeah.
You know, and that's how people think of free speech as a
Right.
threat. And the answer to that question is, even when you're speaking to somebody with whom you have disagreements, and at the end of that conversation, I'm still convinced that I'm right, I've gained some things. What have I gained? Number one, I've gained a lot greater understanding of you,
Yes.
my fellow citizen. Know where you're coming from, know where your heart is. It humanizes you.
Yes.
And I will guarantee you this. I've done free speech work for, I think I volunteered in my first case in 1992. And 99 times out of 100, when you get to know somebody with whom you have strong disagreements, my clients, I often disagreed with them. 99 times out of 100, the more I got to know them, the more I liked them. And the more I understood where they were coming from. Didn't necessarily agree with them. In fact, one time I was giving a closing argument in front of a jury and I said, I'm just going to tell you the truth. My client really annoys me all the time. I'm sorry, and I know, because I had seen him annoying the jury. And I was like, I feel it, I understand it. But at the same time, everything that he said was protected, and here's why. And so when I'm encountering someone with whom I have disagreements, I'm learning from them.
Yeah.
And I'm not just learning to correct my mistakes. In many ways, I'm learning in ways that make my argument stronger. I have often emerged from disagreements with people feeling even better about my position. I debated Chris Christie last week at University of Chicago on the legality of sports gambling. So 2 things about that. For those who still have memories of 2016, I can assure you he did not Marco Rubio me. At no point was I left a deer in the headlights, but I will say Chris Christie hasn't changed very much. He was brutal and relentless in his attacks. Yes. But at the end of that, we went back and forth on the legality of sports gambling, and at the end of it, I felt better about my position because I felt like it took the best shot it could get from the other side.
Yes.
And so from that standpoint, free speech is not compromising your values, it's literally renovating your soul in many ways. So, and then that brings me to another point. I will tell you this, I think if somebody asked me what is the number one issue facing the United States of America today, what is the uber issue? I would say, I can say it in one word, hatred. It is the hatred that red has for blue and blue has for red. And if you look at the statistics, it is staggering. You know, you look 87%, 85% of Republicans would say the median Democrat is bigoted, ignorant, hateful. And flip that around, 85% of Democrats would say that of Republicans. And this has been building for a while. If you go back to 2014, Pew did a survey, and it found that 81% of Republicans said, all the way back in 2014, so this is many years before our present divisions, 82% of Republicans either strongly disliked or somewhat disliked the Democratic Party. And Democrats, as befitting their tolerant image, were a little bit more tolerant. 79% of them either had strong distaste or somewhat disliked the opposing party. So this has been building for a while. And there's 2 things that happen when hatred builds. Number one is you have very little interest in defending the rights of people you hate. When you encounter somebody you hate saying something you don't like, the first thing you're going to start to think is, how can I find a way to shut them up? And you do it in this kind of nefarious way that is like, okay, now how do I find a way to shut them up while I still get to speak?
Yeah.
So we go into this free speech for me and not for thee routine that is extremely, for the person on the receiving end of it, it is radiating hypocrisy and malice. So anytime you start to try to shut up your opponent, you're inflicting upon them a very real injury, especially when you're trying to shut them up about politics, religion, etc. Yeah. And really a core constitutional injury that's at the heart of the founding of this country. So number one, when you're talking about confronting, when you're confronting people who have this diametrically opposed point of view, you're going to get an education. Mm-hmm. Number two, this is going to sound strange, but it is very true. Often you're going to also end up with a friend. And here's what I mean. I don't know, I'm sure I've recognized enough faces in this room to know that a bunch of you in here have been subjected to online hate campaigns, shame campaigns, mobbing, attempted cancellations. And if I asked you, whose help did you appreciate the most? Well, obviously it's going to include like your personal friends. It's going to include your ideological allies who you want to rally to your side. But I guarantee you, top of mind are going to be those few people from the other side who said, this is wrong. If you're on the right and you're getting attacked from the left, the person who matters so much to you is the person on the left who says, stop, this is wrong. I will never forget, I have this great affection for Jake Tapper for this reason. I had this very strange incident where an MSNBC host, apparently misreading a story that misread an article I wrote, said that I didn't care about nuclear war. Why? Because it would hurt women and minorities the most. What? That's insane, okay? But it starts to just spread all over, all over. I'm at a dinner and my phone just starts buzzing and it's text messages. You like nuclear war? What? And I'm looking at this, and these are people with millions of followers. This guy, David French, he likes nuclear war because it will hurt vulnerable people. What? Yeah. And Jake Tapper comes in. Nope, that's not what he said. And I'm not saying Jake is as far as on the left, but Jake was a person not identified as my fellow ideological ally. And he's like, nope, sorry guys, you're getting it wrong. Yeah. Just flipped everything like that. And from that point forward, it was a very tangible way that I experienced the moral weight of this principle, which is, I call it the legal corollary to the golden rule. Defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. And so if you see somebody out there, I don't care if you disagree with them on almost everything, if they are having their civil rights, their civil liberties suppressed unfairly, stand with them. I mean, even if it's just a social media post, whatever it is that you can do, stand with them. And when you do that, you're going to do a couple of things at once. One, you're going to be living the moral value of free speech. Mm-hmm. You're going to be showing not just in law, but in culture and morality that free speech matters. Number two, you're going to be treating a person with whom you have profound disagreements as a fellow citizen, as a neighbor. And this is a very tangible way in a pluralistic society to love your neighbor, is to defend their liberty. Mm-hmm. Few more tangible ways to do that. And then I have so many friends from across the spectrum as a result of doing this, of standing with them. And at the very end of the day, there are some views I've had that have changed. There's no question. Let me put it this way. I got an email from a friend who was in my first year section in law school, and he says, the David I read in the New York Times is different from the David I talked to in 1991. And that's not that's like a cringe thing. You're thinking, what did I say? Yeah. He said, you seem less confident about how the world works. And I was like, you nailed it. You nailed it. And the ultimate goal to my mind of defending that culture of free speech is to the goal. It really gets down to be almost quite personal. It helps you become a lifelong learner. Mm-hmm. Someone who spends a life of curiosity and engagement and community, confident that in an engagement, in that curiosity, and in that community, you can morally renovate and transform this incredible country.
Yes. Oh, that is great. Thank you. Thank you. So, as we wrap up, can you repeat your golden rule, your legal golden rule one more time? Because I just
Yes.
want to make sure you all heard it. It's really good.
Defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself.
So that's homework assignment number 2. So read Frederick Douglass and then think about that and how we stand up and what we defend in our own lives. Please join me in thanking David for our first conversation today.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and president of Beneath the Service and Presidential Leadership Scholar from the class of 2025, Nikki Marin.
Nearly 20 years ago, President George W. Bush walked onto the stage at West Point with nothing more than a stool and a glass of water. What followed was an off-the-record conversation with the senior class that became a foundational lesson in leadership. While holding the highest office in the country, President Bush showed up as a citizen first, connecting to us through openness and compassion. He let his character guide as much as the power of his position, knowing the weight of the responsibility ahead. Years later, I served in the Old Guard and led ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery. A year earlier, I'd been deployed to one of the most volatile regions in Afghanistan, where I lost a close friend who'd been with me in the same West Point auditorium. Experiencing that loss made it clear how far-reaching the effects are on the people left behind, and why the leadership shown in those moments carries such an importance. When I was going through ceremonial training, I knew it needed to be demanding because the environment required attention and care. Every detail, from uniform precision to voice commands, marching and maintaining composure, impacted the experience of the people you were serving. And for those in the midst of loss, the presence you brought mattered. At the Memorial Amphitheater, a quote from President George Washington, written 250 years ago, reads, "When we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen." It reflects the cemetery's deeper purpose of paying tribute to those being remembered as service members and citizens. It reminds the greater public that those we honor are part of the fabric of American life and values. It's that understanding as a military veteran why I founded a nonprofit that focuses on advancing leadership journeys for the veteran community. There are exceptional leadership skills acquired as a result of military service, but leadership training doesn't end when you hang up the uniform. Leadership is shaped by what we live, and learning how to embrace those experiences, the good and the challenging, strengthens our ability to lead. At Beneath the Service, we want you to honor who you are in service of who you will become. And this belief is exactly what led me to the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program. It's a living network bringing together leaders who might never have crossed paths and sends them back into the world more prepared to lead with intention and a stronger sense of responsibility. One of the greatest gifts of the PLS program is its culture of shared growth. Each scholar brings a background informed by their community, career, and calling. Trust develops among leaders who might never have crossed paths, Trust develops among leaders and as we take the time to listen to one another and share our personal stories. the leadership lesson I learned from President Bush nearly 20 years ago at West Point was reinforced again when I was here for the program last year. Never lose sight of bringing compassion to the times that demand strength by letting your character lead as much as your influence. Leadership is lived in the ongoing process of learning with others and in taking responsibility for how that learning impacts what you do. The Presidential Leadership Scholars Program would not be possible without your generosity. It was a privilege to be part of the 10th class. Thank you for investing in leaders like me and for extending an opportunity of a lifetime. Thank you. Thank you so much. I now have the privilege of introducing the next conversation on the land that unites us with Jeff Reinbold from the National Park Foundation, Grace Lee from the National Park Trust, moderated by Kristen King of the Bush Institute. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hello. Let me just tell you that when the Bush Institute was looking months ago to figure out what our plans were for this event and kind of around A250, there was no chance we were not going to talk about the national parks. One of our principals at the helm, Mrs. Bush, is a lifelong lover of parks, an exceptional champion of parks and the outdoors. And because of her, on this site sits a 15-acre Laura Bush Native Texas Park, which is just south of this building, and it is showing off right now, so I recommend that you all get out there. And Grace Lee, we are welcoming back. You were here a year ago with Mrs. Bush.
Yes, our organization, the National Park Trust, was delighted to be able to honor Mrs. Bush's leadership with our American Park Experience Award, to really, celebrate what she's done to promote the awareness and appreciation of our parks, public lands, and waters all across the country. We love that she uses parks as outdoor classrooms, like the park behind this building. And we also love the fact that she combined her love for literacy and parks in creating the children's book with Jenna Bush Hager, Our Great Big Backyard, which is a personal favorite of my grandchildren.
Perfect. So thank you, Mrs. Bush. So I'm going to jump into just a few things before we get into the discussion and just set some norms. There are 63 national parks, but a total of 433 national park system sites that include national monuments, historical sites, battlefields, and recreation areas. So when we talk parks, we're talking about all of those things. And while the U.S. established national parks and championed the concept of preserving our national treasures, other countries have obviously taken this on. But I think one of the most unique things about our historic sites and our monuments is that we preserve our history, and it becomes something that we don't just read about, but we invite Americans to walk through every day. So Jeff, I'm going to start with you. Tell us about the work of the National Park Foundation.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I wish you all could have seen your faces when the lights went down and we saw you watching that and those big images, right? That kind of sense of awe that never really gets old. I would also like to acknowledge Mrs. Bush. You've been a big supporter of the National Park Foundation. I remember your Christmas tree where you decorated the tree at the White House with national park ornaments featuring hundreds of national parks. We did First Bloom together, lots of amazing things. And you also, you lent your name to a campaign that we started in 2019. Our goal was to raise $1 billion for national parks, totally philanthropically, privately, by 2028. Mrs. Bush signed on as our co-chair, and we hit that goal last summer, right? But the National Park Foundation story is actually tied to a different First Lady. Lady Bird Johnson push hard to create a congressionally chartered nonprofit to raise money for national parks. I tell folks that the idea of the national parks, as Ken Burns talks about there, is so audacious. The idea that you would take the most important places in a country and turn them over to the people, not just so they can visit, but we actually own each of these. If you saw more of that video, there's a point in there where Ken Burns talks about how radical that idea is. We copied lots of things from Europe. This one is uniquely American. You take the most important places, and this year, the 250th of the signing of the Declaration, you take those places that define the American spirit and the American landscape and the American story, and you don't put them behind a fence. You make them available to everybody, right? Radical idea. But something that is as big and audacious as that cannot be funded just with federal money alone, and it never has been. The places that we all love were really created by people who cared, who stepped up and said, these places matter. We need to make sure they're here, not just for us, but for future generations. And by the time we hit the 60s, we needed a more coordinated way to do this nationally. And Lady Bird Johnson pushed for the creation of the National Park Foundation to make it easier for the public to be able to get involved, honor this uniquely American tradition of the federal government and private citizens protecting the most important places in the country. If you roll the tape forward to today, each year we grant about $100 million out to national parks and to groups like Grace's to do actual work on the ground. And that money does not come from an endowment. We close to start every year almost at zero and have to go out and fundraise all of that to meet needs in the parks. And it just captures this spirit that people have of not only wanting to visit, but to be part of the protection and sending a statement to future generations on what matters and how we care for what does.
Thank you. Grace?
So the National Park Trust complements the work of the National Park Foundation. We are one of the boots on the ground organizations that supports our parks, the National Park Service. We do it in two ways. We were founded 43 years ago to focus strictly at that time on land acquisition, to be able to make our parks bigger and better. And all of the land projects that we have worked on have been brought to our attention by the national parks, by park officials. And we have the realty expertise, and we have financial resources. Often we have to help financially as well, in addition to a whole host of realty expertise to be able to acquire those lands and hold them often for a period of time before they can convey to the Park Service. Right in your backyard, we actually completed 3 projects, 2 that benefited San Antonio Missions, adding over almost 50 acres there, and also one at LBJ, his National Historical Site, and to be able to buy a parcel that is across the street from LBJ's home. It belonged to his youngest sister, and that house is being renovated now for park official housing. But we also get people to parks, because we learned about 20 years ago, so we've been doing the land trust work for 43 years, but 20 years ago, I was alerted by Park Service officials that they were really concerned that there were not enough young people getting to parks, that their data showed that a park attendance skewed heavily towards older Americans. And because of that, they really challenged us to expand our mission to get more kids to parks. And so we created our fun Buddy Bison School program. We engage kids from kindergarten through high school in that program. We also expanded our education and mission to include college students, because we know they're going to be those future leaders of our country, and we want to make sure that they understand how important public lands and waters are. And then more recently, we were contacted by the Department of Defense and military nonprofit organizations, because they wanted to know how could we bring the concept of the Buddy Bison School program to military families, everything from Gold Star families to veterans to active duty families to those in the reserves and so on. And the reason why it's so important to engage that next generation of people with our parks is because we want them not only to benefit from them, they're wonderful places for education, health and wellness through outdoor recreation, mentally and physically. But also, most importantly, or equally importantly, we want to make sure that they are going to be the future caretakers of our parks. We need those stewards. We need to start with them young, and we need to keep working with them all the way through, their college years and beyond.
How are we doing? Are we seeing a change in the demographics of the visitors?
Yeah, I can say that we are making a difference, and I think that I want to commend the Park Foundation, because we also have a lot of wonderful private donors, but almost 5% of our funds for our youth and family programs come from the National Park Foundation. So we're really grateful for that, and we want to continue that partnership long term. It's been so helpful, but we have been seeing it move the numbers. I think, what just our own anecdotal information is, when we survey teachers and military families, we are finding that the good news about our parks and all they have to offer is definitely spreading through the schools, through the generations that we work with in our programs. And we're also seeing that, people are realizing that the parks belong to me and I belong in the parks, and that we all have a responsibility to not only take care of them, but also the environment. So we now support hundreds of schools across the country, but we want to do more, because we know there's a greater need. There's a lot of teachers who come to us and ask for more resources for their schools, and to be able to bring our program to other schools in their school district.
The work you do in that space is incredible, and while we think about this is a chance to educate fourth graders and others about the parks, it's also their first impression about how we take care of these places, right? You wouldn't have visitors come to your house and you don't clean the place up, right? You want it to look its best. And so my wife is a fourth grade teacher, Title I schools, and she always talks about that every time she takes them to a historic site or a place, like, you're sending a message about what we care about. Very impressionable. So I really appreciate that work. It's not only to educate them, but also to just expose them to how you take care of something as important as this.
Yeah.
Well, and Jeff, we talked a little bit about this, but can you share sort of where are the gaps in where the philanthropic dollars really are making a difference in the park? I think there's some unexpected areas.
There are. Yeah, this is a question we get a lot. Shouldn't the federal government pay for the parks? And the federal funding is really the floor. I worked 35 years for the National Park Service before I joined the foundation, and when I was the superintendent of the National Mall for the last 5 years, our base budget covered about half of what we put on. If you were to go to the National Mall and there were not events commemorating Pearl Harbor Day and all of the other, kind of nationally important dates, we didn't have the money to put that on, right? That would be a disservice to the people that served in those wars, to their families, but we do all of that through partners. And so often the federal money will take care of the basics, and we really work with partners to do more. But sometimes there are moments where we step in that the federal government just can't act fast enough. And so one that's really important to us, Grace just touched on it, is employee housing. You go to these wonderful places, take a Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, an amazing place. Try living there as a seasonal ranger. Try living there with a family of 4, right? We have rangers sleeping in their cars, sleeping in substandard housing. That's not all right, right? That is not okay. The pace of change and how housing costs have gone up in Jackson is unreasonable to think the federal government would keep pace with that. So that is a place where we are stepping in. We're doing more around things like that, where we're not only celebrating enjoying the places, we're celebrating the people who make those experiences possible. So without those rangers, you don't have the same experience. And so housing is a big priority for us right now. I'm sure many of you, this is a big topic in the West, but you can just imagine what it's like to try and live out your dream. And we're at a point where people can't just live on rainbows anymore, right? And the mission, this is a really pressing problem, and one that we're happy to be part of, trying to find a solution to.
Well, that's a good segue to the effects of the parks are not just within the parks, but it's the areas around them, and there's an economic impact on the communities where they live. So talk a little bit about the return on investment.
Yeah, so I always like to refer to parks as an amazing economic engines. They provide so many jobs. They bring dollars in for a whole host of industries related to supporting the tourism industry. And when you think about it, if you build a shopping mall, it will certainly, for a time, provide jobs, bring people in. But places like that have a shelf life. But if we invest in our parks, if we take care of them, if people go and have an amazing experience, if they're astonished and in awe when they leave these places, whether it's because of a story that they learned about that they didn't know about, or these incredibly iconic wonders, then people will keep coming back. They'll come back over and over and over again. They'll tell their friends, they'll tell their neighbors, and it will be something that we're celebrating our country's 250th anniversary. 250 years from now, these places will still be there. Just incredible opportunities for people to learn and explore and enjoy.
To put some numbers to that, it's about $55 billion that the national parks generate. Support about 350,000 jobs in local communities. I think Grace captured it. The one thing I would add that we see all the time is that the communities that are around parks, often the park that is in their neighborhood is part of their identity. If you go to San Antonio Missions right now, right, you're telling the story of that community. And one of the beautiful things that Grace's organization does nationally, and a lot of the on-the-ground nonprofits, it's made up of people from that community having a chance to tell their own story. I think that's incredibly powerful. You can bring an industry into your community. It's incredibly important for jobs, for everything else in the economy. These you get 2 first and 3 first, because you are bringing outside investment into the parks. You're having a great experience for the people who live there and people who visit, but you're also getting a chance to tell your own community story as part of it. It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and people are very proud of the parks in their community. To Jeff's point, they are really, really proud of these places, and there's so many amazing parks that we know about that are the Yosemites and the Everglades and the Yellowstones, but there's so many amazing parks that are lesser known parks that are really incredible. People just need to discover them and explore them.
So you mentioned the jobs and the number, but share with the audience some of the lesser known. I mean, there's the seasonal rangers, but there is an entire ecosystem and an industry of jobs around the parks that are probably lesser known and less opportunities.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, this is one of those you pull on a thread.
Yeah.
And you think of all the outfitters and the outdoor industry and so many organizations that are directly connected, not only the people that provide the food and the lodging, but so many other services that people need when they come to parks. It's an amazing group of partners that we're talking about, the philanthropic partners. Mm-hmm. There's a whole concessionaire world and everybody else that shapes that same experience that is private industry working in these places. And it doesn't begin at the park border, right? It begins when you come to the community. That's where the experience really starts. And so everybody has a hand in that in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we just got back from bringing a group to Yosemite who had never been there before. And all of the planning, because we're the logistics boots on the ground people, as I shared, and all the planning that went behind the scenes, it made me realize, working with my team, who's fantastic, all the layers of planning and organizing with all the different groups that support the park. And a lot of the groups were established to make sure, like even things like shuttle service, so that people don't drive, to really minimize the carbon footprint, and have this amazing shuttle service, and all of the different things that support the park behind the scenes that you don't even notice unless you're planning a trip for 40 people.
Yeah.
Show of hands, who in the audience has been to a national park in the last 5 years? We have park people. We have park people.
We do. I saw Mrs. Bush's hand up, too.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, ma'am. Jeff, I want to turn to your service in the National Park Service, and in particular, you had a very unique and important role in the establishment of Flight 93's memorial. Tell us, how does a new national park happen?
Be created, yeah. Well, hopefully it's not from a national tragedy. So if you're not familiar with Flight 93, that's the 4th plane that crashed on 9/11. Crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, about 30 minutes from where I grew up, outside of Pittsburgh. And usually the Congress waits at least 50 years before they create a new site that's based on a historical event. this one was very clear that 9/11, we all knew right away, was one of those days, unfortunately. And it was an amazing effort to pull together and create this memorial. There were 40 families on the plane, 40 passengers and crew on the plane. And I used to always get in this debate with our colleagues in New York. There's over 2,000 people that were killed in New York. We only had 40, but that also meant that every one of those 40 voices had just an outsized voice, an outsized impact. And it was the most amazing group of people that I've ever met. They represented all parts of society. Some of them were friends with the Bushes. Larry Catuzzi from Houston, his daughter was on the plane. We had some people that were far left. And never had I worked with a group that came together like that they were thrown together because of an event. They didn't have anything else in common. And a local community, very rural community. There was the project was happening at Ground Zero, moving quickly. That's everybody's expectation of what a memorial should be. The Pentagon was moving forward. We had 40 people in a rural community trying to make sense of this. And President Bush came there twice and had the opportunity to take him out on the site, and it was incredibly moving how he related to the group. This won't surprise all of you. His humanity and sincerity was exactly what was needed. The ability to be commander-in-chief and also to listen, right, and not necessarily to tell, was incredibly powerful. But I also remember on the 10th anniversary, where we were opening the first elements of the memorial, and we had former presidents on stage, and President Bush came off first, and I'm at the end of a row, and he comes standing by me. And then President Clinton was coming down, and he's talking and shaking hands with everybody. And I remember President Bush turning to me and saying, "Jeff, I have to deal with this all the time," right? And he's taking shots at President Clinton, and I was like, are we allowed to do this? I don't know if how this happens. But it was amazing that in a moment like that, you know, the acknowledgement that we can go across administrations. There are things that are red, white, and blue. They're not red or blue. And that humanity that he displayed there, while it was funny, it was incredibly telling too. I was really fortunate to be part of the group that tried to make sense of this. And we brought in the National Park Foundation that at that point had not taken on a project of this scale. We needed to raise $50 million going into a recession in rural Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh was very generous to us. A lot of the foundations there got us off on the right foot, but we really needed to come up with, it was not clear that this memorial would happen. We needed to come up with $50 million. And at that point, the federal government was not going to fund this memorial in a big way. And so I often call it a modern day barn raising. It is, yes, there were large donations, but there were lots of small ones. Mm-hmm. And I tell this story that changed my career because I knew at that moment, I was like, I am going at some point I will take off the green and gray and I will go to the other side and raise money. I was on a call with a member of Congress who just didn't think the memorial should be created. I reminded him that he was in the Capitol that day. That didn't sway him. And I was just frustrated. I was just frustrated. And so I went down to the crash site. There's a place that visitors could come and look at it. And anytime we had one of those moments, I would just go and talk to visitors. And I came up to this older couple, did not appear to be people of means at all. And I just started to talk to them. And those conversations restore your faith in humanity in 5 seconds. And they said to me they were from San Diego. And I said, "Oh, where are you headed?" And they looked at me almost offended. And they said, "We're headed here." These people flew from San Diego to Pittsburgh, drove out to Shanksville, 2 hours away, to see their memorial, and then to turn around, drive back to Pittsburgh, and fly back to San Diego. They had been giving $93 a year for years, right? These are people that didn't know anybody on the plane. Who does that, right? What drives you to do that? That's the power that these places have, right? That may be an extreme example, but Grace and I see it every day, right? And that's one of the reasons that this kind of work is so important and so inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On a lighter note, let's move to a lightning round.
Oh, no.
Okay, Grace, favorite National Historic Site?
Oh, I have to say San Antonio Missions. I mean, it's amazing, and to know that what we did is going to make a long-term impact on that park, that's my jam. Thank you.
Jeff?
I'm going to go a little different. We're in the 250th year. There's a place in Pennsylvania, a small battlefield called Fort Necessity. It is where Washington had his first battle. It was in the French and Indian War. He lost. But what comes out of that are the qualities that you see will make the man who leads the creation of the United States. You also see the stage being set for the revolution. It's the debt that is incurred that leads to stamp taxes and other kinds of things. And so what I'm impressed about on the historic sites is when you go there and you pull on a thread, all of a sudden you realize how that is connected to so many other things. We see it around the country all the time. That is one that's really impactful for me, particularly in this year.
Closest encounter with wildlife?
I had a bison outside my window like 2 months ago. Yes, it was amazing. You're not supposed to go near them. We didn't. It came to us. It's in the car. Pretty amazing.
Yeah. So my story is also a bison story. In April of last year, I was at Yellowstone, and we were just driving through. And I encourage you, when you go to these amazing parks, to test out the shoulder season. It's like your private park, and you see things that you would never see. And we're driving our car, and over the ridge comes this huge stampede of bison. They come from both directions. They surround our car. We're driving, and the bison are, their breath. I can see the breath and the coldness out the windows, and I'm trying to videotape it, and they're looking at me, and we're driving, and I said to my husband, don't go too fast, because I didn't know if they were going to stop and charge us. You don't want to mess with a bison out there, but they were just around our entire car as we drove through, and then they eventually peeled off. I was excited, exhilarated, but also terrified. But this is their home, and we really needed to respect and give them as much space as we could.
So what Grace doesn't know is the Park Service staff said, here's a donor. All right, cue the bison.
Exactly.
Go for bison.
And I do have some amazing video to show for it so that people can really see how incredible these massive animals are.
Okay, if you could designate any place in the United States as a national park site.
Oh, wow.
So I have
Nice.
one. I don't know if you all know about the Rosenwald schools, Julius Rosenwald. Okay, I see somebody up here. So if you haven't Googled Julius Rosenwald, Julius Rosenwald was the gentleman who was responsible for taking Sears Roebuck from here to the mega retailer that it became. But he was a philanthropist, and he had an incredible opportunity to meet with Booker T. Washington. And from that, he helped create a movement in which thousands of schools in rural communities in the South and the Midwest, from actually Maryland all the way through the middle of the country in the South, including, I think, thousands of schools in Texas were built to really take care of the African-American children who were not allowed to go to school with other students in their community. And these were, I think it was sort of like the Sears Roebuck, like the houses that they used to ship, and people, it was sort of that model. But it's an incredible story, and the Rosenwald campaign, which we are working with, really wants to create a historical landmark or a historical monument to commemorate the story of Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald School. So if you don't know about it, I did not know about it until we were approached by the folks who wanted to establish this park. So go check it out. It's an incredibly inspirational story. And I don't think there's any national park dedicated to a Jewish American. I'm not aware of any.
Put me on the spot, Grace.
Yeah, it would be the first, the former park superintendent. I think it would be the first. So I urge you to go check it out. It's an amazing story.
I have a confession to make. I didn't go to parks as a kid. I grew up, if you look at every burned out steel mill town that's in a 70s film, that's where I grew up. We just didn't go to national parks. But I fell in love with the national park idea early on. There was something about the idea that captivated me, and one of the things I'm proud of is we try to keep a really big tent at the National Park Foundation, and even if you don't visit, that there's a place for you here. And so what excites me is figuring out what the next ones will be.
Yeah.
Because they're not scripted. There's not a list in DC where you're like, we're gonna do that one and this one. They rise up from the ground,
Exactly.
and I can't think of anything that's more American or more exciting than that.
Okay, well, I feel like we could have gone on for a lot longer, but we are at time. Nobody leaves without homework here. So I'm gonna first give you hours at the Bush Center, and then I'm going to ask both of you to chime in. I'm going to want to get this right. Starting tomorrow, Friday, April 17th, as part of the National Archives Open the Vault traveling exhibit, we are pleased to feature key artifacts from the history of our country's national parks. We will be featuring the act to establish the National Park Service in 1916. That was signed by Woodrow Wilson. So our Dallas groups need to come back and see that. And also the cover of the 1932 Master Plan for Yellowstone National Park, among others. So it'll be really exciting. You'll have to come back to the museum to see it. Grace, call to action.
Yeah. So I'm going to share really quickly. I am a first-generation Chinese American. My parents came from Shanghai. And when I came to this country, it was very hard to fit in. But my parents loved parks, so we would drove with our Chrysler station wagon with no air conditioning and our tent equipment in the back. We drove all across the country, and I developed a love for parks as a child, and that is something I passed on to my children. So to be able to have this job, to be able to provide, work with teachers, and plan their park trips that align with their school curriculum and get kids to parks who would never, ever be able to have this experience is the most wonderful opportunity that I have. And to be able to answer the call to superintendents and the Washington office asking for our help to help acquire land to make our parks bigger and better. There's no better job that I have. And I know Jeff feels the same way with all the amazing resources they raise for the Park Foundation. But I really want to ask you all, America's 250th birthday, you know, if there's a park you've been dying to visit, go explore it. I heard someone say, I've never been to Big Ben. Go to Big Ben. We take military families down there for camping and overnight trips. They absolutely love it. So go take a park off of your bucket list and go visit. Take a park that's on your bucket list, go visit it, and then think about introducing parks to people in your community and supporting organizations that are doing great work to support parks. There are so many out there in addition to ours, because our parks will not survive without private support. We need to be able to, augment what the government can do. So that's my call to action.
I love it. Last night we celebrated some really grand gestures from David Rubenstein to protect some of those places that are quintessential American. And I mentioned the family that donated to Flight 93. I would say wherever you are on that spectrum, whether it's time, if you're in a position where you can donate, do not sit by. Volunteer, get engaged. There is so much noise right now in the country about division. This is not a time to walk away. This is a time to double down on those things that bring us together. I can think of nothing more that does that than our national parks.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Director of Freedom and Democracy at the George W. Bush Institute, Chris Walsh.
Good morning. I know I'm feeling the heart of America. I hope you are too. You know, Frank Costanza, yes, the great character from the sitcom Seinfeld, once shared the origins of the Festivus holiday. Many Christmases ago, he said, I want to buy a doll for my son. I reached for the last one they had, but so did another man. And as rain blows upon him, I realized there must be another way. And Frank was absolutely right. Violence can't be the way we engage with fellow citizens, no matter how intense the competition or how passionately we disagree. There is another way, and it's not Festivus, it's pluralism. 340 million profoundly different Americans respecting each other as equal citizens, disagreeing, competing, living together, acting within the rule of law. In fact, you should check out our new pluralism playbook called We the People, Pluralism in Real Life, a plain-spoken resource for leaders to practice pluralism in their communities. Conveniently provided on this fancy QR code that's out in the halls. Please check it out. Pluralism is also the mission of today's recipient of the George W. Bush Institute citation. He is one of the country's foremost leaders on advancing religious freedom and practicing pluralism. This citation was created to acknowledge those who are making an impact on their community and inspiring others to take action to solve today's most pressing challenges. The recipient must demonstrate a sustained commitment to the cause and be a model by which others are measured. Eboo Patel is such a measuring stick for those of us who love this country and want it to thrive. He is a civic leader, speaker, author, and the founder and president of Interfaith America. Eboo has worked with everyone from American presidents to university students, demonstrating that religious liberty and pluralism are indispensable to the American experiment. Through Interfaith America, Eboo and his team promote cooperation in pursuit of the common good, while also emphasizing that we must simultaneously be free to worship, believe, and think differently. Eboo's vision also helps audiences appreciate how the founder's commitment to religious liberty and pluralism is every American's inheritance. That's true as America celebrates its 250th birthday and looks towards its 500th. Let's get building. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2026 recipient of the George W. Bush Institute Citation, Eboo Patel.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. On August 17, 1790, President George Washington traveled to Newport, Rhode Island, where he met with a man who was concerned about his community and what everybody knew was a new era. Moses Sessions, the warden of Truro Synagogue, asked President Washington what would become of the Jewish community under this new order. Washington responded in one of the great documents in American history, the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. He said that his government would give to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, that all had alike liberties of conscience and immunities of citizenship. He ended the letter by asking the Lord of all mercies to scatter light and not darkness in our paths and make us useful in our vocations. George Washington was building a sacred union on the foundation of religious pluralism. 211 years and 1 month later, President George W. Bush travels to the Islamic center of Washington, D.C. He takes off his shoes before he enters the prayer hall. He meets with a group of Muslim leaders who are concerned about our community in what everybody recognizes is a new era. He goes to the microphone. He says, Islam means peace. The terrorists of 9/11 and your Muslim doctor, your Muslim friend, your Muslim classmate have nothing in common. The Muslims who contribute to the nation make this a great country. Those who would intimidate them are not the best of America. I quote, they are the worst of humankind. President George W. Bush. We are a great country, he ends, because we give everyone equal dignity. He is building a sacred union on the foundation of religious pluralism. The American promise is that we give all a like liberty of conscience. The American genius is that we recognize that when groups are given their freedom, they build up their nation. America would literally be unrecognizable without the contributions of our diverse faith communities. This is pluralism, respect for diverse identities, relationships between different communities, cooperation with one another for the common good. Presidents can set the North Star. We have to reach it. I want to thank President Bush. I want to thank Mrs. Bush. I want to thank the Bush Institute for pointing their finger to that North Star. A sacred union built on the foundation of pluralism. I want us all to feel inspired to do the work of reaching it. I recognize how special this nation is. I recognize how lucky I am to live here. Why? Because we know in America that diversity is a treasure, that identity is a source of pride, that cooperation is better than division, that faith is a bridge, and that everyone is a contributor. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and CEO of the Washington Tattoo and Stand To Veteran Leadership Program Scholar from the class of 2025, Mark Riley.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I'm a 20-year U.S. Army veteran, retired Sergeant Major, and proud alumnus of the George W. Bush Stand To Presidential Leadership Program for Veterans. Cohort 7 graduating this past November. I'm humbled to have had a career in military music. Today, I lead an organization called the Washington Tattoo, and it has nothing to do with ink. It has nothing to do with sleeves, but it has to do with music. So the term tattoo is a military call. In the 18th century, music was used to relay commands on the battlefield and in camp, on the fife, the drum, the bugle, and the bagpipe. Its original Dutch is do dun tap toe, turn off the taps, which actually is, yes, the beer taps. So, last call for alcohol was actually played on the drum. So, it told tavern keepers to turn off the beer taps and send the soldiers back to barracks. Today, a tattoo is an evening military music ceremony celebrated around the world, and the largest of which is in Edinburgh, Scotland. In 2019, with the help and support of the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo, we created the Washington Tattoo to create an opportunity to honor and connect military members and veterans through music. I'm proud to share that in 2026, we are an official America 250 program partner recognized by Congress to celebrate the national celebration of 250 years of American independence. In July this year in Washington, D.C., we will have our flagship event telling the story of 250 years of service through the lens of music. We'll have the U.S. Army Field Band, the Navy Commodores Jazz Ensemble, the Air Force Drill Team, the Grammy Award-winning Black Eagle Singers Native American Ensemble, and massed pipes and drums and more. Reflecting back, it was truly an honor to perform for world leaders like Queen Elizabeth and Pope Francis at the White House. But in those moments, the most powerful moments were not on grand stages. They were in intimate moments of profound humanity, working with wounded warriors at Walter Reed, or visiting the burn unit at Brooke Army Medical Center. And there, I came face to face with 19-year-old soldiers who would never live another normal day in their life again. And so at that point, I saw the true power of music. So each year, the Washington Tattoo harnesses the power of music through classes, workshops, and cohorts. And we provide non-clinical, evidence-informed, skills-based trainings for veterans, military spouses, and veterans, providing employment and also performance opportunities in hospitals at the VA, schools, and communities across the nation. The Bush Center's Stand To Veteran Leadership Program accelerated everything that we were building. It threw lighter fluid, all over a blossoming nonprofit startup. Through the leadership of the George W. Bush Institute, research from RAND Corporation, and evaluation from Syracuse University's Institute for Veteran and Military Families, the Washington Tattoo served over 260 veterans last year. And we started to scale this work into a turnkey nationwide veteran music wellness initiative. With more than 70% of veterans not willing to engage with traditional therapies, music has created a new and different door. Right now, the Washington Tattoo is in a true inflection point where our growth is testing both our business and organizational systems. And I can say with complete sincerity that the experience at the George Bush Institute prepared me for this moment. The curriculum, the civics discussions, the Socratic seminars, and the research were transformational. The intentionality behind every detail of the program, the facilitator's level of excellence, and the warmth and candor of President and Mrs. Bush will make an experience that I will carry for me for the rest of my life, and I cannot be more grateful. It made me a better leader. It made me a better father. It made me a better husband. It made me a better human being, and a more and ever so more proud American. In closing, from the bottom of my heart, I would like to say thank you to everyone in this room, the staff and the leadership of the George W. Bush Institute, and of course, President and Mrs. Bush. Please continue to support the great work happening here. Your support, your passion, and your charity are changing lives. And I am a grateful recipient of your support. So thank you so much.
Please welcome our third conversation, In Pursuit of a More Perfect Union, featuring the President and Chief Executive Officer of the LBJ Foundation, Mark Updegrove, Director, Producer, and Writer for 42nd Parallel Films, Michelle Ferrari, Senior Pastor for St. Luke Community United Methodist Church, Richie Butler, and our moderator, Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute, David Kramer.
Good morning, and that is a really tough act to follow. I would actually like to ask you to join me in thanking again Mark and Nikki for being here today and sharing their stories. We have a fantastic panel here, and we're going to cover 250 years of this country's history in about 40 minutes. So let's give it a shot. And I'm going to kick it off with a question maybe for all three of you, if you don't mind. We'll start, Michelle, with you. Our founding 250 years ago was rooted in two sins. One was slavery, and the other was denial of women the right to vote. But the Constitution also had a mechanism to try to fix shortcomings in our founding documents. How do you see, looking back 250 years, and how we've been doing so far?
I mean, it's interesting. On the one hand, when you think about the process for amending the Constitution, you see a reflection of the fact that the framers of the Constitution themselves were uncertain about the document, in many ways dissatisfied with the document, and very clear about the fact that it was a document of compromise. And so in the ensuing years, you see attempts to sort of tweak it to make it square with emerging realities. So for example, the Constitution had nothing whatsoever to say about suffrage rights. The framers couldn't agree about who should have them or how widely they should be apportioned. And so they sort of punted and left the matter to the states. And there are a number of amendments clearly that deal with the extension of voting rights to larger and larger groups of Americans. But they also didn't perceive the rise of political parties. And so when you have political parties with a slate of candidates, a president and a vice presidential candidate, they had to create an amendment, the 12th Amendment, that changed the way the Electoral College voters cast their votes to address this thing that they hadn't anticipated. On the other hand, though, they made it very hard to change the Constitution, right? So you have to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states have to ratify a proposed amendment to the Constitution. This is an extremely high bar, even if we assume that they didn't anticipate how numerous and how fractious we would become. It's a very high bar. And so it's quite slow. And I don't think suits particularly the American temperament, which, Alexis de Tocqueville described as restless. And as a result, there have only been, since 1795, 17 amendments to the Constitution, and many of them were quite routine matters. Very few of them were controversial, and the ones that were controversial were very controversial, and in many cases took quite a long time, like women's suffrage took 72 years.
And others after a civil war,
right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Richie, let me turn to you and then to Mark on this.
My thoughts on this, first and foremost, I think the Constitution is truly what I classify as a living, breathing, document, and that's a good thing because it wasn't to be placed on a shelf and we bring out periodically. It really was to lean into as we evolve as a society, as a nation, and we recognize our misgivings, our wrongs, and then how do we correct so that we don't repeat. My mother always told me, baby, lessons are taught until they're learned. And so, and so as a nation, we learn from our mistakes. And so I'm confident and convinced as we, look from our beginning to where we are definitely in this process of continuing to correct ourselves and leveraging this important document to place the guardrails, to offer us a way to reflect, to be introspective, but also look into the future to who we can be. And so as we assemble today, it's truly a recognition of where we've been, where we are, and an anticipation of who we will become in spite of current circumstances.
Yeah, our framers knew that they weren't creating a perfect union. We were striving for a more perfect union, and that's why we have these provisions in our government. But I will say that while there are allowances for changing our Constitution, adding amendments to our Constitution, it's really driven by the people, we the people. Martin Luther King said famously on the steps of the state capitol of Alabama in Montgomery, the arc of the moral universe bends slowly toward justice. But it takes us to bend it. It doesn't bend on its own. And frequently our lawmakers follow the people. They don't lead the people. And so we have to bend that arc. We have to ensure that we have a more just union. And that's our responsibility as a people. And that's why it took 72 years to see the fruition of the women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment in 1920. 72 years. But there was this relentless movement. Same with the abolition movement. Same with the civil rights movement. Same with the struggle for gay and lesbian rights in this country. It takes the people to bend that arc, and we have a system that allows for it.
So let me stick with you, Mark, for a minute, and let's focus on the phrase, all men are created equal. This was done when women deliberately were not included in that phrase, and we also realized not all men were created equal.
Yeah.
How could men who were so enlightened to produce an incredible document also themselves be slave owners, have so many shortcomings? And how do we judge people back then by today's standards? Is that fair to do?
No, you have to judge people based on their own times.
Yeah.
You can't take a person out of his or her times. I will say that the founders, there's this wonderful egalitarian creed, all men are created equal. There's no nation on earth that had ever had that embedded in their most basic values. But we didn't live up to it. First of all, they knew they were kicking the issue of slavery down the road for the next generation because they knew it was incendiary and nothing that they could agree on in order to ensure that there was the creation of our country through the Constitution. And so they were certain that that was not going to be addressed until later. when they say all men are created equal in terms of our democratic republic, they're talking about white land-owning men. 50 years later, it becomes all white men, and then you have the sort of the rise of populism and Andrew Jackson coming into office. But again, it takes us until 1920 to see the right of women to vote, and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, where Martin Luther King made that speech about the arc of the moral universe, until we get the Voting Rights Act that allows for the voting for all men. So we don't see the full fruition of our democratic republic until 1965, nearly 200 years after the Declaration of Independence has been etched in parchment.
Richie and Michelle, thoughts on this?
I think Mark hit the nail on the head. I will just add this thought as I think about the question. When we consider where we've been and where we are, I recognize that and this is probably coming from a pastor, that we're all fallible, and we have we've made mistakes. And when I process the fact that as a nation we can sort of lean into this concept and because it's an aspiration, and we're still aspiring to get to that place, a more perfect union, and most importantly that all men and I think when we look at all men are created equal today, we assume that invites women and men, and it doesn't matter your race or creed, but then that was not the reality, and it's just reflective of how we as a nation have evolved, and I always see life from this. My mom said you're the eternal optimist, so I see things from this prism of who we can be. And so when we and not hold on to who we were at our worst or darkest, but to know that we've come out of that and that we don't want to ever go back there. So we have to continue to remind ourselves and reinforce the learnings from our history so that we do not repeat that, and so that we continue to affirm as we are today that all men are created equal, and that we're going to continue to strive and live as a nation so that is reflective of every man, woman, child, no matter their race, creed, religion.
And I have to say, if I may, just going back to what Ibu said, I think one of my proudest moments as an American, and I don't say this because he's in the front row, was when after 9/11, President Bush went into that mosque and came out to proclaim that Islam is peace.
Yeah.
It was at a time when I think many Americans were attempted to scapegoat Muslim Americans, and President Bush reminded us of who we were at that moment, and it made a profound difference.
Agreed.
This is not to take away from what Mark said about people being of their time, but I often think about what it must have been like to gather a group of men together in a room in the summer. Everyone's wearing frock coats, and they are going to design a government, de novo, something that's never been seen on the face of the earth. I think you have to be thinking about the future, right? I mean, you're making a document that's going to govern the country that you live in now, but you're surely thinking about the country it could and should become. And so in that sense, I am inclined to think that much of the language is indeed aspirational. Yeah. They knew what was controversial and they kicked it down the road, but they placed their faith in the notion that it would be resolved at some juncture.
Mm-hmm. So, Michelle, let me stay with you for a minute. There's nothing automatic about democratic progress. There's no linear path to pursue. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes diligence. It can take decades for things to turn around. How do you see the journey that we've been going on?
I hate to quote someone else in this moment, but I recently was reading David Brooks' responses to the comments he got after he wrote his last column for the New York Times. And somebody asked him what advice he would give to young, underprivileged students to give them hope. And he said he would tell them to study history. And this resonated with me because I study history and I love history. And he told them to study history because it would serve as a reminder that we stumble, but we stumble forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very beautiful way of looking at it. The work of our nation is difficult, it's messy, it's fractious, but over time, we do bend toward justice.
Richie?
You know, every day, and I'll cast it this way, you know, we play a role in what this nation will be, who it is and what it will be. And I'm reminded of something that Benjamin Franklin used to do. Every morning he would, you know, wake up and, you know, pose the question, you know, what good will I do today? And then lean into the day. And then at the end of the day, was told that he would coin or go back to a question, what good did I do today? And so I think as we, you know, marinate on 250 years, it is our responsibility, those in this room and every American, to really think about what good am I going to do today that makes this nation live into its creed that all men and women are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. And then when the day is done, what good did I do? And not just every day, but when your life ends, you ought to be able to say what good I did to make this country, as we talk about it as being this great nation, but that I am adding to what it means to be American and to celebrate 250 years and to be part of what the next 250 years will look like.
Mark?
You know, David, I'm reminded of, when we're talking about history, I'm reminded of Harry Truman, who said, the only thing new in the world is the history you don't know. Love that quote. And Winston Churchill said, we can't see the future, but by looking at our past, we can derive hope. And I think you can see, you don't know what is ahead, but if you look at our history, you can derive hope, particularly in this nation, based on these principles. But I was also go back, I was thinking about David French's very eloquent remarks about free speech today. And I think that as we look at today's moment, it's important to note that we have free speech and we should be speaking up for the things that we believe. But I think part of being an American and part of free speech is also listening. Listening to our neighbors, listening to our families, listening to our friends who have different opinions, and accepting that they can believe differently. As long as those views in my minds are within the bounds of our Constitution and are in keeping with American values, they should be listened to and they should be affirmed, even if you don't subscribe to those things. We don't listen enough in today's America, and I do think that social media is a problem in that regard. You can purvey your opinion with impunity. That's a problem. We're not having direct discourse, and we're not listening effectively.
Michelle, let me ask you to talk a little bit about the suffrage movement. The 19th Amendment that was ratified a little over 100 years ago. Tell us a story about that.
I will say the thing to know about the women's suffrage movement is that it took 72 years, has been stated on this stage before, 3 generations of women. 3 generations of women meeting, talking amongst themselves, organizing, campaigning, cajoling, convincing, parading, picketing, pigeonholing legislators at both the state and the federal level, and throughout arguing amongst themselves about tactics and strategy. The movement blows up twice over the course of those 72 years because you have a radical faction and another faction that is more content to play, within the lines, to color within the lines, and they don't agree and they go their separate ways. But in the end, their objective is achieved in part by the unintentional collaboration of their methods. And you see this repeated in other movements for social change, including the civil rights movement. But 72 years it took. The resistance was overwhelming. It came from every quarter, including from women themselves who didn't want to be sucked into the rough and tumble of the political sphere. Very often elections were held in taverns, and women who wanted to focus on their children and who wanted their husbands to make the decisions for the household. When the first women's rights meeting was held in 1848, they were looking to pass the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. When it finally passed in August of 1920, it was the 19th Amendment, which gives you some indication of what it took to get it through. And it was a hard-won battle.
Richie and Mark, I want to turn to the two of you and talk about the civil rights movement, but in order to understand that, you have to go back quite a ways and look at the Civil War as well, where I think the total casualties were 1.5 million, 620,000 of whom were killed. It was the bloodiest war in our nation's history. Slavery, of course, was abolished. 4 million slaves were freed. Talk us through from there to sort of the civil rights movement and where we are today.
No,
please.
No, you.
All right.
Too polite.
Years ago, the LBJ Presidential Library did a civil rights summit to mark the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act. President Bush and all of our living presidents participated, including Barack Obama, who said, he gave a warning. He said, history doesn't always travel forward. History travels sideways. History travels backwards. And we saw after the Civil War and Reconstruction, this great effort to move forward in the wake of the Civil War, some setbacks in the areas of civil rights. Despite the fact that there had been the abolition of slavery, there were major setbacks for people of color in this country. And that led to the civil rights movement of the 20th century. I think one of the most successful movements that we've seen based on the practices, the nonviolent practices of Mahatma Gandhi. So an amazing leap forward under the leadership of Martin Luther King. But I think but we have to remember again that the pendulum not only swings one way, inevitably it will swing back. And it is up to us to ensure that it swings in the right direction to meet the changing needs of our plural democracy.
I think we have a clip, actually.
Oh, great.
President Johnson, if we have that queued up.
I think it's very important that we not to say that we're doing this and we not do it just because it's Negroes or whites, but we take the position that every person born in this country, when he reaches a certain age, that he have a right to vote, just like he has a right to fight, and that we just extend it, whether it's a Negro, whether it's a Mexican, or who it is. And number two, I think that we don't want special privilege for anybody. We want equality for all, and we can stand on that principle. But I think if you can contribute a great deal by getting your leaders and you yourself taking very simple examples of discrimination. If you just take a simple thing and repeat it often enough, even if it wasn't true, why people accept it. Well, now this is true, and if you can find the worst condition that you run into in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana, or South Carolina, where, well, I think one of the worst I ever heard of is the president of the school at Tuskegee, or the head of the government department there, or something, being denied the right to cast a vote. And if you just take that one illustration and get it on radio and get it on television, get it on in the pulpits, get it in the meetings, get it every place you can, pretty soon the fellow that didn't do anything but drive a tractor, he'll say, well, that's not right, that's not fair.
David, there are 643 hours of LBJ doing the business of his presidency that are the crown jewels of the LBJ Presidential Library archives. And of those 643 hours, that is my very favorite conversation. And the reason is because LBJ knows he needs the movement in order to get to see through the fruition of voting rights. And he's encouraging him to wage the movement. That's an amazing thing, because he knows if you expose Americans to the very worst of voting suppression, as he says, and this is a direct quote, there isn't a fellow who doesn't do anything all day but follow or drive a tractor who won't say that isn't right, that isn't fair. And that's prescient, because literally 2 months to the day after that phone conversation in 1965, you have John Lewis standing at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge with a line of civil rights protesters behind him being brutally assaulted by Alabama state troopers. That goes on the airwaves. Americans see that firsthand, and they won't stand for it. And you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that it is an amazing conversation for so many reasons. Because at that moment, LBJ, despite being the leader of the free world, knows he doesn't have the power to see voting rights through. He needs that movement to expose Americans to the worst. They see it, they won't stand for it, and we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Richie.
First of all, I should have gone before Mark. My bad.
Too polite, too polite.
We should have gone before the guy with the drum.
That's right, that's right. You know, I think this part of our history, I mean, one, it's so complex and a lot to unpack.
Yep.
And especially as someone who's an ancestor of those who were enslaved. You know, I will say this. You know, I think it shouldn't be a sort of a paragraph in history books. And I think sometimes, you know, in our effort to, you know, sort of minimize our, you know, the bad, you know, we don't, you know, confront it and deal with it in a manner that I think makes us better in the long term. And we recognize even today, and this is someone who pastors a predominantly African-American congregation and dealing with the African-American community, there is a real, you know, sense of urgency that there is this whole effort to erase what happened and the progress that has been made. And so, you know, as we reflect upon 250 years, you know, I think we have to, you know, be proactive around wrestling. And I know it's not something we want to, you know, I've been married for quite a while, and sometimes I would much rather not deal with some of the things that I've done in my past. and sort of, sweetie, let's just skirt past it. You know, we're not there anymore. But truth of the matter is, you know, sweetie's not going to go into the future if we can't deal with what has transpired in our relationship. And so, you know, I want to put that on the table as a part of our conversation. And then, you know, as I think about, you know, that history and where we've been, I would employ you to take advantage of the African American Museum in D.C. It is, it is transformational, and you ought to leave there in tears, you ought to leave there convicted, but you ought to leave there hopeful, because there's a resilient group of people who look like me that didn't give up on being an American and fight as hard as anyone else to maintain this country and believe in its, you know, in its greatest value, and, you know, we'll die for it and have died for it without getting the recognition or acknowledgement. And so to summarize, I think it's so important for us to recognize and again, deal with this past and recognizing that if we don't, we will continue to, repeat. And we wonder why we repeat, because we're not confronting what was.
Let me ask you, as a pastor, but also a leader in the community, what do you find are the most effective tactics to take that approach?
Yeah, great question. In some of our work, in particular, work we do in Project Unity, and a lot of this is, born around racial issues. And so I always tell people, I don't want to call you out on racism. It doesn't help, us moving forward. So if someone does something and we call it racism, typically what that does is it puts that person on the defensive, and their, dukes are up, and, they're defending themselves. And what I believe we must do is call each other out on our humanity, and invite each other into conversation and relationship, because our problems are solved and they're addressed because we are in relationship with each other. As the clip showed, Dr. King and President Johnson were in relationship. And if we're in relationship, one, we begin to recognize each other's humanity. And I think that is a starting point. And I'll offer the other piece of that is this engagement has to be around the area of just starting to listen to each other. It is, think about this. When you take a subject matter that is near and dear to someone's heart, race, we go from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond in terms of our emotions. And sometimes it's not easy to listen to someone else, especially when their perspective is very different from ours. But that is part, I think, relationship and engaging from that vantage point, and just starting to and think about this. God gave us 2 ears and a mouth so that we listen more than we speak. And we should practice that.
Michelle, you've indicated to me a couple times you have dreaded the question I'm about to ask you.
Awesome.
So I'm going to ask you. What does progress for our democracy look like?
I have indeed dreaded this question. I'm not sure whether it's a function of my interest in history or whether I'm showing my age, but I think that progress in this moment consists, ironically, of going back a bit. Or perhaps the better term is recentering. I'd like for us to recenter civil discourse and compromise as national virtues and national values. I think there's a lot that has gone into the toxic brew that is our current political moment. Some of it is the echo chamber of the internet and being able to speak your mind plainly while alone in a room, and suffering no consequence or even a response directed in response to what you've said, and providing no opportunity whatsoever to listen. And I think I'm so grateful to be here. This invitation kind of came out of the blue, and I didn't know what to expect. But as I said to David earlier, the United States political culture has kind of felt like an acid bath lately, and being here has been a balm, because in every conversation that I've had with people of varying political views, with perhaps different agendas, it feels very much of like mind. And I think, when we think about the suffrage amendment, for example, that was women meeting at least every year. They would have a convention, and they would break off into discussion groups and talk about the Constitution and talk about their place in the United States and talk about strategy and tactics and what it all meant. And I think we need, as citizens of this country, to do that more. And I think the other piece of that is that we need to be better educated about how the country works. It's very disconcerting to me to think of people voting who don't even know what the three branches of government are.
Yeah, that's right.
Agreed.
So bring civics back too.
So we've only got a few minutes left. I actually want to ask each of you to reflect on a personal level. Was there a particular thing in your upbringing or young adulthood that pushed you to want to tell stories, to explain to our fellow citizens who we are, where we've come from, the progress we've made, the challenges we face? Mark, maybe start with you.
You know, David, I think about when I was a little kid. I grew up in lower middle class Philadelphia, and I just in the outskirts of Philadelphia. And I remember that at the bottom of my block on a busy street was a parade for former Vice President Richard Nixon, who was running for the presidency. And I went down to the end of the block. I was just a little kid, and I had this little American flag that somebody gave me, and we waved the flag as Richard Nixon passed. And I thought to myself, I can't believe I'm seeing that guy who was the former vice president of the United States and is running for the presidency of our nation. And that really inspired me. It made a profound impact on me, just being able to see and wave a flag, that Richard Nixon. And so I think after that I became captivated by history, because I was kind of seeing it in front of my eyes. There was history going right by me, right in a open top car, waving to the people. And I thought that was just an amazing reflection of who we are, and I've been captivated by the presidency and our history ever since.
Richie.
Growing up in Austin, Texas, one particular moment stands out, and before I describe that moment, I will also acknowledge that I grew up in the church. I was a church baby. I wasn't a PK, but if there was a service at 9 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock, 11, 3, 5, I was there. And so the church and around faith and social justice, sort of molded me. But I would add to or build upon what Mark talked about in terms of a moment. Jesse Jackson came to Austin when he was, running for president, and to see this man who's running for president, and you remember, he would talk about upward hope and keep hope alive, and kept saying that. And so I truly, believe, looking at him, my faith, that those culminating moments over the years has helped to, shape me into. So I went and preached at a church in Austin some years ago, and the pastor introduced me. He said, he's the Unity pastor in Dallas. And I'm like, I am claiming that because I truly believe that what unites us is greater than what divides us. And one of our greatest foes today is, I believe, the monetization of division. And so how do we, move to a place where we truly can unify? And so that is what I breathe, wake up thinking about. And I think is no greater place than the United States to actualize that, where democracy and diversity has converged. And my friends, if the world is to survive, we've got to get this thing right.
Michelle, last word to you.
So when I was a child, my mother would complain that at family dinner, I would not eat because I had figured out that everyone else was eating, and I therefore had a captive audience. I would just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So, pair that with a fantastic high school history teacher, and I guess I was sort of on my way. It has been really the joy of my life to be working in historical documentary film, and to be able to bring these stories to a wider public, wider than I could in a classroom anywhere. I love history because I feel like it makes me understand the world that I live in, and therefore points a way forward. And I want to share that with people, because if we're not thinking about our past and how to engineer our way forward, we're just sort of wandering aimlessly. And I don't think that that's healthy for our society. I was on the subway in New York, and it was a car with one advertisement through the entire car. And it was for AI companions, like a service selling AI companions. And someone had scrawled across one of the frames, "We do not have to accept this future."
Yeah, indeed. Awesome. We do need each other. I'm grateful to the three of you for sharing these personal perspectives at the end. I'm grateful to the three of you for being with us today to share your thoughts on our nation's glorious history with all of its challenges and shortcomings along the way. So please join me in thanking this great panel.